Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kat Plimpton. I'm the Outreach Manager with the Northwest Energy Coalition, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm joining this event from Seattle. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that I am on the traditional land of the Coast Salish tribes, specifically the Duwamish, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, and Muckleshoot peoples, past and present, and I honor with gratitude the land itself and these tribal communities. I hope you will do the same from wherever you are today. Please go ahead and use the chat box to share your name, organization, pronouns, and acknowledgement of tribal land you are on. The Northwest Energy Coalition is an alliance of over 100 member organizations and many individual members. We advance clean, equitable, and affordable energy policies by leveraging our analytic expertise and convening a broad alliance of people and organizations. Thank you to our sponsor, Idaho Power Company, for supporting today's Lunch and Learn on utility planning. The coalition strives to create a safe space for people of all races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, genders, and abilities. A key part of this is ensuring that participants of virtual events like this one engage respectfully with one another and with our panelists. You can turn on closed captioning by clicking on the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We encourage you to engage in the chat on the topics speakers are discussing during this panel. Please ensure your messages are on topic and respectful of the panelists and other participants. Disrespectful comments will be grounds for removal from this learning session. We are putting a link in the chat to our pamphlet for this session, which includes the speaker bios and a survey we'd like you to fill out at the end of today's session. You can also donate to the coalition in support of our work and these learning sessions. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Johnny Bosch, our moderator for today.
Thanks, Kat, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. My name is Johnny Bosch, as Kat said, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate with the Northwest Energy Coalition. I use the pronouns she and her. This is the second of our 4 Lunch and Learn sessions on utility planning in a changing landscape. I hope you were able to join us for the first session last week, which was an introduction to utility integrated resource planning. Now more than ever, state policies advancing clean energy and decarbonization are the driving forces in utility resource selection. Washington State adopted a clean electricity standard in 2019 and the Climate Commitment Act earlier this year, while Oregon has adopted 100% clean electricity standard based on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And Idaho Power has voluntarily committed to achieving 100% clean. Today, we will explore how those recent policy changes and others in Pacific Northwest states might impact utility planning. We're pleased to have Commissioner Letha Tawney from the Oregon Public Utility Commission and Elaine Hart, founding principal at Moment Energy Insights, with us today. As Kat said, their detailed biographies are in the chat, and I encourage you to read those. We'll have each panelist first give short opening remarks, and after each one, we'll take a few questions from you all. Nancy Hirsch, the Coalition Director, will be monitoring the chat and managing the questions. I also have some questions for our 2 panelists, and we'll have additional opportunities for participants to ask questions during the discussion. So we're going to get started, and with Elaine, you're up first.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. I've got a couple of slides. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me today. I'm going to be spending just a few minutes walking through some sort of foundational ground setting information so that we're all kind of on the same page here. So I'm going to be talking about the challenges of sort of both scale and scope in implementing 2 recent pieces of legislation out of Washington and Oregon that affect how we do planning in the utility industry. So I guess at first I want to acknowledge that while I'll be focusing on these two recent pieces of legislation, the Washington Clean Energy Transition Act, or CETA, which was passed in 2019, and Oregon's House Bill 2021, which was passed in 2021. These are just two of many policies that have been adopted over the years to drive a clean energy transition in the Pacific Northwest, and some of those are highlighted on this timeline here. But you can see that while these two policies, I think, are going to have a really big impact on utility planning, it's nothing new to have big policies that sort of create new targets for utilities. And planning is always changing and adapting to whatever the most recent policies are. So this is where we're at now, and no doubt there will be new policies down the road that we'll be adapting to as well. But this is all part of this path of ratcheting our clean energy policies up over the years. I'll start with a really high-level overview of CETA in Washington. So CETA applies to all retail electricity sales. It requires no coal serving Washington customers by 2025. It requires utilities to be greenhouse gas neutral by 2030 with some alternative compliance options. And you can see this in the chart on the right here. Up to 20% of the net retail load can be met with these alternative compliance options by 2030. But by 2045, it requires that the power be 100% clean, and it removes that sort of buffer that's allowed in 2030. In terms of planning, the utilities are required to file clean energy implementation plans where they set out how exactly they're going to be meeting these targets. And it also requires that utilities consider the social cost of greenhouse gases in their resource planning. And I think really importantly, and this will probably come up a number of times today, it requires utilities to consider impacts to vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities, and to roll those considerations into planning in a way that we haven't traditionally considered in utility planning. This is sort of a paradigm shift in this industry. In advance of this lunch and learn, I did some sort of back of the envelope calculations to try to figure out how much clean energy are we really talking about here with these policies. And so lots of caveats on these numbers. They're rough estimates and don't take them to the bank. But it looks like achieving the 2030 targets in CETA could require up to about 7,000 megawatts of additional renewables between now and the end of 2029. That's only 8 years away. That's nearly 900 megawatts per year. Not all of that will be new renewable development, and I'll talk more about that in a second. There are other ways that we could be increasing the clean energy that goes toward Washington utility customers. But that's a lot of renewables as sort of an upper bound. Next up, we'll talk about Oregon House Bill 2021. This applies to the large IOUs operating, investor-owned utilities operating in Oregon, Portland General Electric, PacifiCorp, as well as electricity service suppliers that serve large industrial customers who've opted to get their power through direct access. It establishes greenhouse gas reduction targets relative to historical baseline levels, which will be determined by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And from that baseline, it requires a reduction in the emissions associated with serving Oregon customers by 80% by 2030, 90% by 2035, and 100% by 2040. To meet those goals, it requires utilities to develop clean energy plans that'll be filed concurrently with their integrated resource plans. So they'll be based on a lot of the same information and assumptions, and in theory should be coordinated with their IRPs. It also adopts a whole bunch of additional policies. So it bans permitting of new or expansion of gas plants. It adopts responsible labor standards, and it adopts policies related to environmental justice, customer supported renewables, and community renewables as well. I also did this sort of back of the envelope for House Bill 2021 implementation. And at a very high level, meeting the requirements in 2030 could mean about 5,000 megawatts of additional renewables over the next 8 years. So that's over 600 megawatts per year. And again, some of that might come from actions that aren't just developing new renewables in the region. So to put all that in context, how much clean energy is this? This graph shows in this sort of dark gray color the historical development of renewables in Oregon and Washington over the years. You can see there's a pretty big ramp up between around 2005 to 2011 or 12. That was around the first round of RPS policies, and a lot of the utilities taking action to meet those. And then there was a little bit of a lull for a few years, and it's recently started to ramp up again, in particular due to the expiration of federal tax credits. And then the turquoise area above that existing band there is the estimated new clean energy needs that could be associated with these two policies. And so it's not an unprecedented ramp. We had a pretty big ramp earlier in the 2000s, but it is quite large and it's sustained, and in aggregate, I'd say it's pretty unprecedented for what we've been able to do in terms of developing clean energy. So this is a lot of renewables. This is a lot of clean energy. Not all of it, as I said, will be new renewables being developed in the Pacific Northwest. Some of this will be redirection of existing resources that are currently going to serve customers in other states that maybe have clean energy policies on the books as well. There may be some sort of reallocation or redirection of the renewable attributes of those resources to utilities in Oregon and Washington. But if those states also have their own clean energy policies, then when you redirect the renewables to Oregon and Washington, then someone's going to have to go out and replace, sort of backfill. And so you could see this indirectly spur development in other parts of the West as well. What we miss when we look at this 10,000 foot view is quite a bit. His first point is that procuring renewable energy isn't the same as integrating renewable energy. This quantity of clean energy is going to require that we operate the system in a dramatically different way than the way that we operate the system today. And you can't just go out and buy this stuff and expect that you're going to be able to operate the system. So I think we'll probably touch on some of those changes in the lunch and learn today. Resource adequacy, which is the ability to ensure that you have enough supply to meet demand in all hours, is pretty challenging without reliance on traditional fossil fuel resources. It's not something we really know how to do yet, but it's something we're going to have to figure out if we want to be successful in implementing these policies. And then there are a whole bunch of objectives of these policies that just going out and procuring renewables isn't going to accomplish. A few of them are listed here: impacts and benefits to communities, high quality jobs, energy security and resiliency, equitable distribution of benefits. These are all objectives that are listed in the legislation that you have to be really thoughtful to bring about in ways maybe that we're not used to doing in traditional utility planning. So these policies are, I guess my point is, these policies are really aimed at creating this sort of fundamental change in our electricity system. And many of the processes, the models, and the frameworks that we have for making decisions are kind of more designed around incrementalism. So I think it's really going to shake some things up. The way I see it, there are sort of two dimensions where I think we're going to see things changing. Utilities in the Northwest, we're used to largely planning in isolation, and we've usually treated utility customers as monolithic or sort of uniform in terms of their needs when we're thinking about these high-level planning questions. But if you zoom out, you see that each of the utilities, that's going to be trying to comply with these laws is actually part of a very interconnected system across the West. And we're actually going to need to rely on that interconnectedness in order to bring about this transition in our electricity system in a manner that's both reliable and efficient. In other words, each of the utilities can try to go alone, but it'll be very expensive and it'll be really hard to keep it reliable. It'll be a lot easier if the utilities can figure out how to work together through regional coordination. But that's not something that we usually think about in traditional utility planning, at least not with a lot of sophistication. And then if you zoom in, these policies directly challenge the notion that utility customers are monolithic and have the same types of needs. And it requires that these policies be implemented in a way that really support communities and promote equitable outcomes. And that's also not something that traditional utility planning has focused on. So there's an opportunity here to just fundamentally change the way that we think about planning for the system. It's all very complex, and for anything that's complex, it's important to get as much input as possible. And so I guess I'll just wrap up with a plug for participation in all of the public processes that are going to go into implementation of these policies. So as I mentioned, in Washington, there will be clean energy implementation plans. Those are the first round of those are currently being finalized, and there's opportunities to participate in those processes. In Oregon, there'll be these clean energy plan processes. Those will be filed with the next round of utility IRPs, and those will involve public input. There will be regulatory processes around implementation of HB 2021. That legislation is so recent that those haven't fully started yet, but keep an eye out for them. And then there are a bunch of regional conversations that are going to be increasingly important to actually implementing these policies and integrating all of the clean energy into the broader West. And those are happening at the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, the Western Resource Adequacy Program, and there's a new Western Markets Exploratory Group. I think that'll be quite interesting to keep an eye on as well. So with that, Whirlwind, I'm gonna
thanks,
hand
Elaine.
it over.
Thank you. That was a really useful framing of the planning challenge and a good reminder that this isn't new, that planning has changed before, but the incrementalism is really going to be a big question. Nancy, do we have any questions for Elaine?
We don't yet.
Okay.
I guess I might take the moderator's prerogative or ask you for the moderator's prerogative and ask a question which relates to kind of the demand side. You talked about some big megawatt numbers and how some of these megawatts won't come for new development, but redirecting existing resources that are serving other regions. What about the potential for demand side resources to bring those numbers down? You didn't mention that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent call out. So we have the ability to reduce that amount of additional clean energy that we need by expanding energy efficiency. For those estimates, I just kind of assume that the current growth rates continue over the next 10 to 20 years, and energy efficiency could certainly bring those down. On the flip side, broader efforts to decarbonize the economy, which could involve electrification, both transportation and things like heating, could also drive those numbers up. And so it's important that we be thoughtful about, as we think about decarbonizing at an economy-wide level, how to do that in the most efficient way possible. And I'll also mention that I noted resource adequacy as a challenge in a decarbonized system. I don't think we've yet taken a holistic approach to thinking about how much we can really get out of the demand side flexibility through demand response programs, especially as we're integrating potentially new electric loads onto the system, especially electric vehicles. We've kind of taken a piecemeal approach to these types of questions in the past, but when you've only got 10 to 15 years to create this sort of radical change, it's time to start thinking a little bit more aggressively and holistically about those types of options.
And we'll do one more question, Johnny, and then
Okay.
turn to Commissioner Connie. Rob Smith asks, can the clean energy goals be met without the 4 dams on the lower Snake River?
That's I unfortunately don't have an answer to that question today, but would be happy to maybe do some research and chat about it offline.
Great. Okay. If that's the last question, Nancy, then Commissioner Tani, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much. Let me first do sound check. You can hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to come and lunch and learn with you as we live through this transition that Elaine highlighted. I see a lot of names I don't recognize on the participant list, so it's lovely to get to be with a new group of folks. And I thought I'd just start out by saying, first off, 100% believe the urgency of the climate crisis. So let's just be really clear. I get it, and I'm really pleased that the legislature has made clear what performance they want to see out of the utilities. I see on a daily basis already how the climate impacts are devastating communities, and also really putting the affordability and reliability of the essential service that is energy access in real danger. And so absolutely get the urgency of these timelines. Accomplishing this transition in a least cost manner is also incredibly critical because even if we get differentiated rates set up and in place for low-income customers, even as we really strive to implement what the protections that the legislatures have put forward, utility rates are regressive. And more than that, the most vulnerable to energy burden live often in substandard housing, the least weatherized housing. They have the least access to energy efficient appliances and so on. So they often end up using more kilowatt hours to get the same energy service that a middle class or a well-off family might. And we just have to remain very conscious of that. I think Elaine's really laid out well sort of the shift that's in front of us, where before we might have been said we were primarily focused on least cost, least risk pathways to optimize reliability. Now we're talking about least cost, least risk pathways to compliance while maintaining reliability. And that seems very straightforward to say, but I think that the challenge about it is it brings even more unknowns into the decision-making process. It makes trying to make choices in the space of so much unknown that much more challenging. Elaine pointed out we did do this. We have been doing this in the early RPS years. So when the utilities, in the early years, when it wasn't clear how costly the RPS was going to be, the utilities would bring forward glide paths to try to optimize the right moment to bring in the next tranche of renewables to be in compliance with RPS. And you face a question about not moving too early because prices were falling, and if you move early, then you take optionality off the table, but also not wanting to move too late. You don't ever want to risk non-compliance, but even beyond that, of course, understanding that the legislative direction for the RPS was to add renewables. So you're always trying to balance that moment, and we really try to use planning and glide paths to find that right moment. That debate was really overtaken by how fast renewable energy prices fell and the scale of the federal subsidies for them. And that meant that meeting those RPS requirements was also going to lower rates for customers. And that was a fantastic win-win. I think in this case, we will see some price declines over time, right? We expect batteries to continue to decline in price as the industry scales, or heat pumps and heat pump hot water heaters are going to continue to decline as their adoption increases. But it's hard to see how this step in the transition will not raise rates and not put some pressure on bills. I think we can all agree that rates are probably artificially low because the cost of fossil fuel pollution is pushed out of bills and into fence-line communities or climate impacted communities. Those externalities don't show up on bills today. And so bills are artificially low. But when you have the degree of energy burdened households that we do in the Pacific Northwest, I think you have to be really cautious about being dismissive of how incorporating those costs or incorporating the cost of the transition will impact those households. The legislation has told us to be thoughtful about that. I worry that the willingness to pay or willingness to host infrastructure in middle-class households and well-off households in the Pacific Northwest has real limits. We'll see when we have to put transmission through whether it ends up in low-income neighborhoods or high-income neighborhoods. I think we all know how that will go, and it will be a real challenge to have an equitable outcome if the behavior of well-off families in my school district is any indication or bellwether of how the conversation might unfold. I think we have a real challenge in front of us. That's all a really long way of saying this adds new cost uncertainty, but the technical planning approach likely doesn't radically change. Its existing limitations really become exacerbated, and how far it can take us in the conversation likely becomes clearer and clearer as we try to unpack this. But I'm really looking forward to this conversation today because I have a lot to learn. We're all learning together as we figure this out and as we do this absolutely necessary transition. So thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Tani. That's a intimidating description of all the new balls you're going to be balancing in the air as a commissioner as these plans come in. Nancy, do we have any questions for Commissioner Tani in the chat yet?
We have a couple questions. They are not yet related. I think they're still holdover to, I think people are typing because I have
Oh, okay.
on my chat. But while those are coming in, I want to ask about in thinking about the equity issues that you raised, Commissioner Tani. We did have a question about kind of the life cycle costs of any resource. Really, nothing is benign, right? But as we think about, and you mentioned on siting, but what about the materials used to go into renewable energy products? And what about recycling of solar or wind turbines? Can we create an environment where we are being holistic in how we view those resources and the equity impacts that they might have and how we factor that into our planning?
It's a great question, and I think we're much more aware than we might have been the last time we did these really massive investments in the infrastructure, in the impact of things like heavy metals in silicon, in doping silicon for solar panels, or how will we manage decommissioning wind farms. We have, at least in Oregon, always set aside a little bit in customer bills for example, decommissioning the coal plants. Right from the start, when the coal plants were put in, we began collecting funds for the eventual decommissioning of those. And I would anticipate that model helps in some respects. I'm really interested in seeing how we'll start to fold in some of the labor requirements and so on that are in HB 2021 into procurement. But we don't have a lot of insight from where we sit or a lot of regulatory oversight over the whole supply chain, right? So which solar panels got put on the community solar facility? That's a pretty big distance from where I am. But I think you're raising an important question, and there might be, well, it's an overall question as well, because when you start to do cost, there's a race to the bottom in terms of cost, and so that creates a challenge as well in terms of those supply chains.
Okay, Johnny, I turn it back to you.
Okay. To start off the discussion, then, I want to spin to a question that you both alluded to in a way that, Elaine, you said the planning paradigm we currently have. Your last slides were showing how it's challenged by these larger questions that we're now throwing at the utilities. And Commissioner Tawny, you talked about equity and how we're going to look at bigger pictures around equity. So I'm curious that in the context of all this, the new direction, the legislation, the new demands, what are the integrated resource plans good at and what can they not do? Can those IRPs be changed to meet the current demands? Do we need new or additional tools? How are we going to try to achieve those bigger integrations and include those issues that may not be adequately included today? And either one of you could go first. I'm wide open.
Well, I can kick things off if it's helpful.
Sure.
I think IRPs are good at planning to constraints and mandates at a high level. So in some ways, these bills are they send the right type of signal for an IRP to be able to be directly affected in terms of like the decisions that come out of the IRP process by the legislation. You have to hit this target. Thou shalt hit the target. And the models are good at hitting targets when you tell them that they have to hit the targets. It's much more straightforward than sort of like an economic trade-off. In Oregon, we've used a carbon price in the IRP for a long time. And that's helpful in terms of it drives decisions that drive, carbon out of the system, but you end up with these economic trade-offs and it's hard to wrap your brain around those. It's much easier to just say, follow this line and do what you have to do. So IRPs are good at that. I'd say where they really fall short with respect to these policies is, and I kind of made this point in my opening remarks, but planning for procuring renewables, that's necessary to achieve these policies, but you can't operate the system just by going out and buying the energy. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to happen to make the electricity system work with these new resources, resource adequacy, renewable integration. These are going to require, I think, really unprecedented levels of coordination across geographies. So we're going to have to, in the West, be much better coordinated, whether that occurs through organized markets or other means in operations and in planning. If everybody's planning to keep their lights on without looking at what's going on with their neighbor, we're going to be making poor planning decisions because there are a lot of efficiencies that can come by taking advantage of the diversity. The fact that when I turn on a light switch, it's not the same time that Johnny's turning on a light switch. It's the same, having a wind farm where it's blowing in one part of the West while it's not in another part of the West gives you that same type of efficiency. So the bigger the footprint you can kind of optimize over, the cheaper it's going to be to operate that system and the easier it is to operate it reliably. We don't have all the tools in our toolbox that we need to do that, and they're probably not going to come about from IRPs. IRPs might be able to send a signal though to say, hey, there's a problem here. If we have to do it, if we have to go it alone, it's going to be really expensive. Maybe we should be creating a new tool to help us tackle these challenges together. So there's sort of geographic, I'd say sort of efficiencies or tools that need to be developed. There's also interactions all the way down to the and the IRPs are mostly focused on the bulk system, but a lot of change needs to happen all the way downstream, all the way down to the distribution system. And those systems don't talk well to each other in utility planning yet. There's interactions between the electricity system and the gas system. Those systems don't talk well yet. And they're often, maybe slightly touched on or glossed over or given lip service sort of in the current processes, but we have to really start engaging with them more rigorously moving forward. And I'll say the last thing that IRPs don't do well, and this is from personal experiences, it's not easy to engage communities in the IRP process. It's a highly technical, political exercise with entrenched interests and equations that seem arbitrary, that are used for some reason that was developed 10 years ago that may or may not have relevance in today's reality, and bringing everybody up to speed to engage in that conversation is really hard, and it might not actually also create any change. And so I do think we need some sort of complementary processes to make sure that we're bringing more voices into the decision making, even if we can't necessarily get IRP experts from all walks of life participating in that specific process. That's not the only process that we have, and that shouldn't be the only way that people have to influence decision making.
Commissioner Tawny, do you see any need? I mean, you deal with IRPs all the time. Do you see needs for additional tools or ways you could ensure that the IRPs are addressing what's been passed and the challenges they're facing?
Yeah, I think Elaine has covered really well what IRPs do well and what they don't. I think what I'd add to that is there's some specific gaps that make them beyond what she's described, that make them a little make them challenging, right? They're very good at, as a decision maker, at giving me a bead on directionally and in broad strokes what is a least cost, least risk pathway to the constraint. And that's incredibly helpful because lots of people have lots of opinions about what that pathway should look like, and the modeling helps sort of ground truth some of those opinions. We will need some of this and some of that, probably not all of this and none of that, sort of comes through in the model really well. I think where I struggle with them is, they don't capture not just the regional diversity benefit that we might get from, say, a regional resource adequacy program, but the regional benefit we're already getting from the Western energy imbalance market. So Oregon is getting a huge amount of solar in the middle of the day flowing north for free from California. That doesn't show up in the IRP for a whole host of reasons. And so then the IRP sort of over illustrates adding solar in Oregon is valuable. Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not meaningfully displacing the emissions from the coal fleet. There's a space that the IRP is good at capturing and a piece that it's not there. I think they also really struggle because models do the economically efficient choice, right? It's all based on what is the price of the alternatives and picking the right alternative based on the price. They're really not good at capturing both action outside the sector, like Elaine pointed to, sort of political realities, right? They're relatively dumb in the sense that they'll over-select the cheapest resource. Right now, that's solar without batteries. Because it looks so cheap that the model makes it appear as though just adding tons of that will solve the problem or decarbonize. And then you bring in the reliability questions that Elaine is raising, and you start to peel back, well, that may not actually work. It also doesn't capture the social constraints, right? Building that much solar will rapidly run into land use questions and communities that don't want it. We know, for example, the most efficient, economically efficient way to do this is to build a great deal of transmission. There's no way sort of politically we're going to get that much transmission built. And the model doesn't know that. The model doesn't understand that there's a hard limit. We don't know where it is of how much transmission communities will accept. And it might not be the economically efficient amount that they'll accept because they are valuing a bunch of co-benefits that don't show up in the model. And that's where the engagement with communities that Elaine is pointing to is really important. We're tasked with least cost, least risk planning. The reality is this transition brings a whole host of values and co-benefits to the table that aren't always under our regulatory purview, and that tension is challenging.
So Elaine, did you want to respond to any of that, or I'll ask Nancy for if there's some questions, because it's been a really interesting conversation. I'm sure we've generated some.
Yes, we have a couple, and you know, one of them is about it is putting, like Elaine, you mentioned a price on carbon. It's already embedded in the Oregon IRP process. Washington utilities use it also. Have a price on carbon included. Is that enough to kind of bring some of the I mean, it brings a goal, kind of a political goal and a societal goal of reducing carbon through the IRP process, which is an economic process. And it kind of, so it brings those two together. Is that enough to really change the decisions that are being made in order to help satisfy the goals of both Oregon and Washington? Is that sufficient? And then Johnny, after that, I have one more question.
Okay.
I'd love to weigh in on that. I think it has been very useful for gauging the risk of, for having a good grounded conversation about potential future compliance risk, the true cost of the coal plants. I think we have used the IRPs very effectively to unpack how expensive the coal plants are without the GHG price, and identify pathways to move those coal plants off out of the system because they are costly for customers in a straight up economic basis today, no price on carbon required. And I think that's important because our colleagues, the other states that we share those coal plants with, are not swayed by a discussion on a price on carbon, but they are deeply swayed by costs being imputed to their customers by expensive coal plants. It's a much more sustainable pathway towards actually moving that coal effectively out of the system. But I think the challenge we have today is when you put a price on carbon, coal and gas are more expensive than alternatives. But which alternative do you pick? Of the many elements of zero carbon, which is the right fit for the next step in the transition? Which co-benefit do you value more? Do you have the transmission to deliver any of the cheap ones, or are you going to go look at the higher cost ones that are local because you don't have the transmission? Those are much harder questions that a price on carbon doesn't touch. And so I think we're sort of, from my perspective, the relative economics are pretty settled. The fossil resources are expensive relatively and unacceptable now because of the legislation. So done. Now the question becomes in some ways, a much harder puzzle of how we build the system in a least cost way, having taken those resources just off the table. I'd much rather be engaged in that question, honestly.
I guess I would add, I think that the price on carbon provides, it's to me, it's really useful information to have to contextualize planning decisions. It's also very complicated to do sort of the technical modeling with the price on carbon when you don't actually have a carbon market. And so, and that can create a whole bunch of conflict in these processes in terms of, are you capturing the cost in this way or that way? Or does that give you an inconsistent picture between how you think your system's going to operate because you're modeling with a carbon price and how it actually will operate, and create some distance between expectations and reality? And that's really challenging, I think, for everyone to grapple with. I still think I think it's still very useful to have all of those views. And so, and when I was a planner, I found it very helpful to have a price on carbon when there was a political will to make decisions that were consistent with a price on carbon, and without a price on carbon, the models wouldn't let you do it at times. I guess I would also just point back to, and I think this is perhaps in part what Commissioner Tani is referring to it when she's talking about co-benefits. There are other objectives from these policies that are not strictly reducing carbon. And so the price on carbon isn't going to help you differentiate between a program that supports local resiliency and creates local jobs and procuring solar out in the desert somewhere and bringing it in on big transmission lines. And those are important things to be grappling with intention, and not looking to sort of a model to output and tell you the answer.
The political side that Commissioner Tani was referring to earlier.
Right, and that brings me to a kind of a related question, which is storage. Right, that's one of those things where if you just put it in the model, as Commissioner Tani mentioned, picking solar without storage is the cheapest option. But we need storage, and we need different kinds of storage. And we've had a question about how much might we need, and how do we get that into the system? It's one of those co-benefits. It provides actually quite a bit of support for the region. But it may not be something that one individual IRP will select. But how do we get the region as a whole to invest in some mix of storage, both large scale and small scale?
I can offer perspective. It's really it's interesting to think about storage in this region, because we have so much storage to start with, and we're unique in that the federal hydro system offers a significant amount of storage, and in some circumstances that can suppress the signal to build more storage. Also, efforts to expand regionalization suppresses the signal to build storage, because if I can trade with my neighbor, that's kind of the same as charging and discharging a battery. It turns out if their needs are different, then show up at different times than mine. So from my perspective, it's a we need everything. We need regional coordination, and we need new storage. The question is sort of how much and where. Do you put storage out with solar behind the inverter so you can optimize utilization of the transmission that you're using to bring it to loads, or do you put it in communities so you can use it for other things when the power goes out? I don't know that we know the answer there. I imagine that we'll do a little bit of both. But on the planning side, it's important that we continue to innovate in terms of how our models are treating storage, to make sure that we're capturing its technical capabilities, and not just in time, but also sort of in space, the benefits that it can provide when it's interconnected at different voltages. So the things it can do when it's on your distribution system that it can't do if it's sitting out in the desert. And we're going to see that not just in IRPs, but distribution system planning processes as well. And it's important that those are talking to each other so we can make informed decisions with regard to storage. But if you just look for the bulk system economically optimal solution, storage might not fall out unless you take every other option off the table, which in some cases you do. And then that's what you pick.
And I think the question points to one of the challenges in front of us, which is, it is easy, it's sort of everyone has their key solution, right? There is, whether that is driven from a position of interest, that's their profit model and how they make their money, or it's a position of passion, or both. It's really easy to end up as a regulator in a position where what I'm confronted with is a whole lot of folks advocating for an individual slice of the solution. And the reality is it's going to be a lot of a little bit of all of it. There's enough pie to go around, that's for sure. We're going to be building an enormous amount in order to do this. And what the models help us do that I find incredibly valuable is give us some directionality about those trade-offs that Elaine is pointing to, right? Okay, storage in the community is going to be X cost more than storage on the bulk system, but I get Y co-benefits for it. And I'm hearing from the community a willingness to either pay for those co-benefits, or I'm hearing from the legislature that they value those co-benefits, and so it's okay to put them in rates. But without the modeling, what I'm faced with is an enormous variety of stakeholders who, for an enormous variety of reasons, have their favorite thing. And balancing all of that through this transition is really hard, especially given that I don't have a good bead on how the rest of the economy is going to decarbonize and put pressure on the electricity system and ask the electricity system to shoulder the burden, either because that's politically easier, or from a policy perspective, that's where the lever is, or because it's the most economically efficient place to do it. So I find the models, as limited as they are, helpful for understanding sort of how big a slice of each favorite thing might I need to make room for.
Thanks, Nancy. Were there other questions?
There are, but I'm gonna turn it back to you to ask your next question.
Okay. I think the first question that jumps to mind with what you just described is that those larger societal policy demands, whether it's just in the state or in the region, it's a real challenge for how planning for a specific utility can actually be integrated into that larger framework that, Elaine, you had on one of your slides, that and the role the states will play with that too, and how can our plans actually start, our planning framework, I should say, can start actually looking at that bigger context. I know some of the decarbonization plans for, say, Washington, I think Oregon's working on some, are talking about those economy-wide, but how does that actually get reflected then into a single plan for a single utility that's woven into the web? And Elaine's nodding, so I'll call on her first.
Sure, yeah, I think what we're talking about with deep decarbonization is really structural change to how we produce, transport, and consume energy. These are like radically different scenarios than the types of assumptions that go into IRP planning. IRP planning, traditionally, it's you might have a new policy that you have to plan for, but the world is usually kind of the same when you look for it. You're looking at maybe gas prices are high or low, maybe technology costs are a little higher or low, but they're not dramatically different worlds that you're planning for. With the amount of change that is contemplated in these deep decarbonization studies, there are massive uncertainties around where we'll be getting our energy from and what we'll be using to store energy over the course of the year. Are we going to have is there going to be a hydrogen economy? Threshold question. Are we going to decarbonize? Are we going to electrify heating in buildings? Big threshold question. And so I guess we don't really have a internally consistent North Star in Oregon with respect to these questions. We don't have a statewide, economy-wide, rubber stamped state of Oregon view of what these different worlds might be. If we did have one, those could be scenarios that could go into utility plans, for example, and you could charge the utilities with saying, you need to think about how your plans would be different in this world versus that world, which we, both of which are potential options as we go down this pathway. That's a massive gap that we have right now. And some utilities sort of have taken it upon themselves to try to create those worldviews to put into their planning. But they're not going to be consistent across the utilities, and so you're going to get kind of a mishmash. And I can see how it would be difficult to make a decision regarding like the validity or of any of those assumptions when you're when they're all when none of them are internally consistent. So I'm not sure that's an answer, more of just an expansion of the problem statement.
And as a follow-up question, I think it was in 2019, 5 Western states passed various forms of clean energy bills. So we can't be the only region trying to grapple with this larger picture. Have you heard anything from across the country or other places of ways to pull regional thinking together?
Well, I think that already, when it comes to the electricity sector, it's already sort of part of the process to take a look at the West. And when you're trying to model what the electricity market is going to look like that you're going to be exposed to as a utility in the West, consider all of the policies that have been adopted and make some assumptions about how other entities in the West are going to be complying with those policies, what that will mean for their resource mix, what that will mean for their load. Those are really complicated studies. They're usually hired out to consultants, and then these experts in this, you don't have an expert in these things like at every utility necessarily. And so we kind of have that picture in the electricity sector, but and you can debate about how valid those pictures are, but at least we have something, we have a framework. We don't really have that across sectors with transportation, with natural gas.
Is this a conversation point, Commissioner Lethe, when all the commissioners across the country get together?
Oh gosh, whenever you get all of us together, we talk a lot. We learn from each other, but I think the very first thing you'll hear is one size does not fit all. And we need to do it our way in our state. So perhaps, I think this is where we see real value in the resource adequacy program that's emerging across much of the West. It's called from the Northwest Power Pool, but it won't give us the long-term planning view that Elaine is pointing to, but it'll at least give us a nearer term view into opportunities for load and resource diversity that will help us avoid overbuilding. Elaine's pointing to, and you're pointing to a really fundamental challenge, and one that isn't necessarily in the purview of the PUC, right? We don't oversee transportation. We need to work with our DEQs and understand what they're doing, and then try to bring that world that they're creating into our planning and understand what its implications are. I think about the winter heating challenge and the debate about are we going to reduce the fossil carbon profile of natural gas, or are we going to electrify? My guess is we're going to do some of both, but I don't know. And what I'm left with when I need to make a decision is, well, what I do know is that energy efficiency that targets that heating load is probably cheaper than either of those futures, electrifying or greening up the fossil gas. And so that's a no regrets investment, and we can put a check mark by that, and then we got to figure out some way to let the rest of the debate unfold and understand the relative economics of those choices. But it leaves us making incremental choices while we let the issues sort of ripen and the technologies mature. And I think that's not bad for ratepayers, right? If you were to place all your bets today on how you were going to get to that future, you'd place a significant portion of them wrong. And so to some degree, letting the conversation ripen is okay. We just have to be doing it at a pretty rapid pace.
So does the definition of least cost or least reasonable cost change when there's a target that has to be met?
No, it's still the target may have been reliability, a 1 in, an LOL, a loss of load probability of 1 in 10 years before, and now it's that plus a particular carbon profile. I think you're still striving for the least cost, least risk pathway because of the energy burden challenge and the regressive nature of rates. There isn't extra money to sort of throw around. You have to be really conscious of the risks you're taking on, or the risks you're letting be put on ratepayers, given the scale of energy burden that we have in just this period. And that's where, in my prior work on innovation, I think the federal government plays an incredibly important role in buying down some of that technology risk and so on. They can weather it better, can weather the risk of failure better than an individual utilities customer base can.
So before I move to another question, Nancy, I just want to check because I'm not looking at the chat.
Yep. Thank you, Johnny. And there is a question that kind of, again, it gets to this, to the issue of kind of co-benefits, and even if it's not lowest cost, we talked about this a little bit with storage, energy efficiency, reducing demand. You just mentioned that, Commissioner Tawney, as a key factor, and yet the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's current plan doesn't economically see as much energy efficiency as we think is out there. And is that because of the model and the modeling, or is that because it's not valuing all of the benefits that come from energy efficiency? And I would throw kind of demand response in there as well as a resource. So we are seeing that also with some utility IRPs as well, where energy efficiency gets selected by the model after some other resources. And how do we always make sure it's our first resource of choice to use less?
Yep.
Be more efficient.
I can jump in on the energy efficiency findings of the Power Council. I think it's probably a combination of both the modeling and whether co-benefits are considered. On the modeling side, there's a challenge when you're, all of these things are effectively being selected by optimization models, and optimization models will give you an answer that strongly depends on what costs you include in the problem and what costs you don't include in the problem. When you're doing optimization modeling, portfolio optimization, and all that in part of the West, but you're trying to consider what's going on in the rest of the West, things get really sticky and really challenging, and you can end up with some unintuitive findings. And my view is that that's kind of, I put the diminishing of energy efficiency in that category of sort of unintuitive findings, which is, yes, we do expect that there will be excess solar available coming from California and the desert Southwest during certain hours that will suppress power prices in the Pacific Northwest. We've already seen this. I expect it to continue. But should we be planning for free energy? Should we be planning for California and the desert Southwest to subsidize our system in perpetuity to the extent that we don't need energy efficiency? If we were optimizing globally, we'd see that they need less renewables to meet their objective if we all did efficiency. If we optimize locally, we see that if they go make some decisions and build renewables, we can rely on all that excess energy to reduce, what we need to build. So there's a disconnect there, and I suspect that's contributing to that finding. But I would also suspect that if you looked at if you looked at all of the benefits, the sort of non-energy benefits of energy efficiency, and tried to do a global optimization on the economy, not just the electricity system, you would also see more energy efficiency. So it's all about where these boundaries are drawn. And that's the challenge in utility planning, is we have pretty strictly defined boundaries that don't include all the costs that customers see. When we look at energy burden in terms of electricity, we're not always looking at the entire sort of energy wallet. How much are they also spending on all of these other things because of the energy infrastructure in their home or in their garage? Those things don't hit utility bills, and so we're not always able to make decisions with them in mind.
That's really well said. And, I'm not in a position to comment on the Power Council's model, but I know when we were working on the last PGE IRP, we had a similar finding with the model over selecting wind, just picking sort of scale of wind, saying a scale of wind was economic for customers. It just brought so much risk into the portfolio that we sort of all said, that's not the right blend. But the model couldn't see the scale of risk over centralizing on that much wind was going to produce. And so I think the models only get you so far. And that's why we talk a lot about their limitations. And I think while they likely won't change dramatically as we grapple with this new constraint, their limitations become more and more meaningful and more challenging to deal with because of all the points Elaine is raising. I think it's not just that the electricity sector planning world is relatively constrained. Our regulatory authority is relatively constrained. Right? We don't optimize all energy across the whole economy for the whole of the West. We're trying to protect a utility's customers from unreasonable cost, unreasonable risk, and ensuring that we're walking down the road to compliance and that they're meeting their customers' desires and so on. It's a smaller world than this optimization that I think folks crave, but is difficult to realize in action. And we have the same problem in how we handle wildfire threat, right? I was at a conference talking with a wildfire expert in California, and he was pointing out that California, the utilities are spending $8 billion a year on wildfire hardening to try to get ignitions to zero. If you spent $8 billion a year on California on lands treatments, you would probably reduce risk significantly more. But you can't, because that's you've got to raise $8 billion of tax dollars, and that, the complexity of that just feels impossible. And so you spend $8 billion of ratepayer dollars instead on a suboptimal solution. We have to figure out how to get out of those silos, but there's challenges to doing that. There are real challenges.
The silo piece is really challenging, because we see energy services and electricity as fundamental human rights, right? They're essential services, and they have environmental, cultural, and economic impacts on people, and those things are our society wide. Is there a future that you can see that breaks down some of those silos that you mentioned, and helps us plan for our system more holistically, given the role that energy services play? And I use that word intentionally and not just electricity. I think we have to get away from kilowatt hours and therms and more into energy service.
I think we have to strive for it. I look at the deep decarbonization studies that come out either nationally or regionally and try to unpack what they mean, what they tell us about what we're missing or what we're not missing when we do our take our narrower actions. You know, and it is helpful. I find it helpful if advocates bring into the record, because remember, we have to make decisions based on the record before us. So there's a silo, right? If it's not in the record in the rate case or the IRP, or I can't just sort of make a finding because I read a study. That's not how decision making in my role works. Those kinds of pieces, especially if they're connected back, right? It's not useful as just general background, but connecting it back to why we might want to think about something bigger or how this connects back to your regulatory authority is enormously helpful, right? That helps, that gives us a pathway to get out of our silo, but it has to be connected back to our legislated regulatory authority, because that's, right, legally what we do have limits. We are not the gods of the energy sector. So we don't get to just by fiat say things. I think the flip side of what you're asking is we have an inherently adversarial process in PUCs. That is the nature of the process. Not always, but mostly, and there's good reasons for that history. And we're striving to find more collaborative ways, more workshop approaches to co-create and so on. But the reality is, at the end of the day, we're making choices that are balancing a wide range of interests. And it is really common for advocates to narrow our silo, right? To their point of advocacy, whatever that is. It's a utility, it's a clean tech company, it's an environmental justice advocate. It is the nature of advocacy, and it's not that somebody's doing something wrong. And so it is a little bit, the nature of our process just makes it inherently difficult to get to those broader questions. When we come down to a decision, we've been handed, people have brought to us sort of their little narrow keyhole on the issue, and we have to piece that all together and make a choice that balances all those interests. And we try to do it, I think, with that sense of that longer vision, but it's a challenge.
Johnny, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, I was going to ask, as a follow-up to that, do you see that we're getting to a place where your statutory authority needs to be broadened, or that any commissioner's statutory authority, so they could look at more silos in a sense and try to build bridges between those? Or is that something that can be addressed through an expanded or changed planning process? Because the political, as you talked about earlier, is an intangible on this. And so to be able to look at a larger economic picture that some of these laws are looking at, would that help?
I think these laws have explicitly asked us to, right? Putting labor standards in. Really, I'm incredibly excited that we have now the authority to do differentiated rates and to think about energy burden in a different way, as well as not just thinking about bill credits, but thinking about demand side solutions to energy burden. Really excited about that. And so I think we've got space to sort of feel that out. You know, and even when you think about Energy Trust of Oregon and how we think about cost effectiveness there, we have strived to bring in non-energy benefits when appropriate and so on. So I think you see us trying to do that, I think, and having some space to try that out. But I think it's also a question of how to have stakeholders and particularly the really expert advocates bringing more of that to the table would be really helpful.
Okay.
I think it's a lot to ask our newer stakeholders who are not so steeped in this economics construct to make the leap across to our economics view. And I think I wonder if our more expert stakeholders could do more of that, could make more of that reach.
On the other side of the lane, in terms of planning models, I mean, there seem to be a lot of silos on the planning side. Like, I've rarely seen regional transmission considerations coming into an IRP. And you mentioned earlier distribution planning, so maybe better management. And now we've got an equity, which has been treated as a silo up till now, that we're now shoehorning into the planning process. Is there a way to build better bridges or break down silo walls in the planning process?
Yeah, I think these have arisen for many reasons, and it'll be hard to sort of break down a lot of those reasons. So that there's different regulatory processes around these decisions. There's different departments, some people in different locations. That I guess now we're all in different locations, but it's the utilities are siloed internally, and these processes are siloed externally, and that's really hard to get around. I think that one way to sort of encourage breaking down those silos is to, rather than think about the planning challenges from the perspective of the solution, which is, all right, I'm thinking about planning challenges from the perspective of retiring resources or adding resources because I do IRP and that's what we can do. Or like I'm a distribution planner, so I can build a substation, or I can, underground a line, or what have you. Think about what those planning questions are from the perspective of the customer. And then different solutions are, let the solutions come to you from the experience of the customer. If you think about an outage, for example, you could be in an outage because of a failure on the distribution system. You could be in an outage because, or a failure on the transmission system. You could have a reliability of supply issue, a resource adequacy issue. All of these could result in the same experience for the customer. And if you think about what that customer is actually going to go through in that circumstance, you might find that you should spend all the money overbuilding the system, undergrounding the lines, killing all the squirrels, whatever, I don't know, whatever it is that you do to prevent that. Or you might think of something more creative to help the customer ride through that situation for a couple of hours, if they really need to, or if it's a time when the customer isn't home, or maybe it has less consequence. So if you think about it, if you think about the human impacts of these things, rather than the engineering solutions, I think you'll have better, more creative options and solutions, hopefully lower cost portfolios of things that the utility might consider. And maybe I would just put that out to the advocates and to the commissions, is to challenge the utilities to think about these things from that lens, instead of, whatever tool it is that process happens to have in its toolbox.
Thank you. Nancy, I'm just checking in because I don't know what's happened on the chat.
Well, we had a very kind of a technical question, which is, what about DC transmission, right? So we talked earlier about the need for new construction. We're going to need new transmission. We're going to need new renewables. If we convert our current AC cross Cascades lines up and down Oregon and Washington into DC, we increase output significantly. Is that something in the planning process that could be brought in as a question for the utilities to be thinking about? And I don't know anything about the cost.
Well,
that was part of the question.
Yeah. Right. I mean, the first thing the utility would do is try to gauge what's the cost of that versus a more traditional solution, and maybe the cost pays off, maybe it doesn't. But your pointing to, we've been talking about integrated resource planning, which is about the generating sort of resources, and distribution system planning, which is about how we keep the distribution system healthy and growing to meet demand and so on. We've not talked at all about how siloed transmission planning is, which I know NWAC is deeply familiar with because you have the lovely Fred Hewitt, who has worked his whole career on making that better. Boy, that question would land so squarely in the transmission planning processes of our dreams. And FERC started a whole process to see if they can move transmission planning forward. That's exactly the sort of trade-off that becomes really difficult to figure out where you embed it and make the understand what you would gain and what you would lose, or what it might cost.
The only thing I
So
would,
deeply unsatisfactory answer.
Oh, that was a great answer. That's
Yeah.
exactly.
I'm going to add an equally unsatisfying response because I don't really know a whole lot about this topic, but I will say we do have a lot of physical transmission capability in this region. We don't do a particularly good job of utilizing it in the way that we'll need to with high penetrations of renewables. So I think sort of the zeroth order problem is how do we use what we have better? And I know that there are massive institutional challenges to doing that. And I'm not sure if those challenges are greater or smaller than the challenges associated with building new transmission. So I think they're great on both sides, but I think that probably both are going to be needed.
That sounds like it's part of that bigger network you were showing earlier. It's a regional issue. And so how do we get stakeholders and utilities together to talk about how to do that and maybe drill a hole in the
several
silo?
of us are spending an enormous amount of time trying to do exactly that, right? Trying to build that deeper, move towards those models that use what we have more efficiently because of the potential benefit to customers. It's like energy efficiency. There's clearly benefit to customers. We're going to have it in this world, in this future. It doesn't inherently reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it lets us accomplish that goal at lower costs, almost certainly. And so it's something we spend a lot of time on.
Sort of, and Nancy, unless there are no other questions, I have a last question of, if you could control all planning in your dream world, what would be the best change you could see coming, or that you would mandate for planning processes? How would the planning process work even better from your perspective? If you could just, no cost, just make a change. The surprise question.
Well, I'm a modeler, so if I could snap my fingers, planning processes would all use open source tools with publicly available data sets, so that you could have some real transparency into the technical aspects of the analysis. There are probably changes that would be more impactful, but from the perspective of trying to improve the transparency of these processes that can have really big implications, seems like that would be helpful.
I think for me, it would be folks being more open to what the planning actually gives us and what it doesn't give us. So planning gives us a good general direction on the map. It says, you probably need to be somewhere in this quadrant, but it's a whole bunch of other processes, regulatory processes about setting up individual programs that might provide subsidies or not provide subsidies, but smooth other barriers for technologies, the RFP process and what it brings forward, transmission interconnection process and what it allows to come forward, that all actually define what we're going to get on the system, right? The plan just sort of tells you directionally, these are the things you should be trying to enable more of. But planning, I mean, maybe the model spits out that you're going to have, 2.42 megawatts of XYZ. But whether you're really going to get that or not is so, it's not useful to pursue. It's what's useful to pursue in my mind is, okay, these are the 4 or 5 key things I need to prioritize making space for on the system. And these are the barriers to making space for them in a cost-effective way. And then letting the innovation process unfold, right? Because different stakeholders and communities and technology providers and financiers and so on will actually find a way to fill that space if I've made it. And I won't be able to know, I don't know from here, is it going to be, lots of offshore wind, only a little bit of offshore wind and lots of this other thing, or, and I don't need to know. I just need to know, spend your time making space for these key elements and then let innovation unfold. And I would add, we're talking in this conversation about planning, but we can sort of set out plans and intention, and that's really valuable and important. It doesn't mean that the coal retires off the system, right? That doesn't mean it just, all the fossil resources just go away. I think there's a really important role, particularly for advocates, to be thinking hard about, just because Oregon and Washington have made these choices doesn't mean the states where the coal plants are actually located are going to choose to retire those coal plants, or even to economically dispatch them as opposed to over dispatch them. And we see this in the MISO market in the Midwest, where coal is dispatching uneconomically because of a whole variety of other reasons. And so I think it's important to talk about planning and set out that intention. I think it's incredibly important for advocates to stay engaged in conversations that are meaningful in those communities about those fossil resources. And so that's not going to be opening with climate impacts. That's going to be talking about the cost of those resources, the impact on frontline communities, what a just transition looks like, and so on. So I would just put out there, planning's a good conversation. We gotta, we have to do follow through.
Well, we're down to 2 minutes. I could talk about this a whole lot longer. I want to thank you both. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate the time you've taken to share your thoughts with us. Nancy, I want to thank you for monitoring the questions. And I think Kat had signaled to me that she had a few things in closing to say, so I'll kick it back to you, Kat. Again, thank you both.
Thanks, Johnny. I put the link to the pamphlet in the chat where you can donate and you can fill out our survey. And we have our next Lunch and Learn at the same time next week, and you can register there. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Great conversation. Really, really great. Very thoughtful.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone.